Hola a todos, muy buenas tardes. Estamos iniciando una nueva transmisión de SAB, Sociales Audiovisual, en este caso junto con Cecilia Ravena para este evento del Departamento de Ciencias Sociales. Cecilia, buenas tardes.
Hola Gustavo, muy buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Bienvenidos a este nuevo inicio de la transmisión, como dice Gustavo, de SAB Sociales Audiovisuales. Como mencionamos en el primer encuentro que hicimos en marzo, ¿sí? En el ciclo Tiempo de Mujeres, ahora estamos iniciando esta nueva transmisión, ¿sí? Presentando y teniendo presente diferentes proyectos para de alguna forma brindar y generar contenidos que sean de interés para la universidad y para todas las personas que les interese, ¿verdad? Gustavo, en este momento, ¿qué vamos a presentar o cuál es el nuevo evento que se va a presentar?
Bien, estamos justamente asistiendo a las segundas jornadas de Fundamentos y Aplicaciones de la Interdisciplina. La verdad que es un encuentro que ya arrancó el día lunes, 2 encuentros durante el día. Hoy estamos asistiendo a una conferencia emérita, así que en un ratito les vamos a dar el pase de los moderadores. Pero, Cecilia, recordamos a aquellos que aún no lo hacen, ¿qué recomendación hacemos siempre en cada transmisión?
Bueno, la idea es que se puedan suscribir a través de este canal, a través de YouTube, ¿sí? Entonces, lo que va pasando es que todas esas propuestas que vamos haciendo de estos diferentes eventos, les va a llegar un aviso de nuevas conferencias, nuevos ciclos que vamos a ir realizando a lo largo de todo este 2021, ¿no? La idea es ir generando constantemente contenidos. Así que para estar al tanto de esos contenidos, les pedimos que se suscriban al canal, ¿sí?
Perfecto, entonces si te parece vamos a dar lugar a quienes van a coordinar y moderar este evento, esta conferencia emérita, Diálogo sobre conocimiento científico e interdisciplina, así que los dejamos con el comité organizador.
Bienvenidos.
Bueno, muchas gracias por prestarnos el espacio para transmitir por YouTube. Ahora estamos en este momento sumando por el Zoom a todos los participantes también de esta actividad. Así que en un minutito nada más les vamos a contar cómo va a ser esta charla. Esta charla va a ser en inglés, es lo primero para decirles, pero de todas maneras las preguntas las pueden escribir en español en el chat. Y esta charla con Steven y Hilary Rose va a ser una charla que esperamos que sea sumamente enriquecedora para todos, porque la idea es que podamos discutir sobre la trayectoria de ellos, pero al mismo también sobre el estado de la ciencia, del quehacer científico y nuestra labor cotidiana y cómo pensar distintas formas de producir conocimiento colectivo, cooperativo y que desafíe a las formas imperantes hoy que promocionan la privatización del conocimiento, sobre lo cual ellos han trabajado muchísimo. Les cuento simplemente muy rápido cómo pensamos esta charla. Va a ser justamente eso, una charla, no una conferencia emérita. Cuando invitamos a Steven y a Hilary nos dijeron, sí, aceptamos, pero no queremos dar una conferencia emérita, lo que queremos es discutir, conocerles, hablar, poder compartir experiencias, dialogar, y ese es el objetivo, aunque la modalidad virtual lo vuelve un poco complicado. Así que sin más preámbulos, yo le paso ahora la palabra a Mercedes. Ella va a brevemente presentar a Steven y a Hilary y vamos a ahí ya pasar directamente a hablar en inglés para charlar con ellos, que ya están ahí como los ven en la cámara. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Voy a brevemente presentar a Steven y Hilary. Hilary Rose es socióloga de la ciencia y feminista, profesora visitante en la London School of Economics y emérita en la Universidad de Bradford. Fue miembro fundadora de la Sociedad Británica por la Responsabilidad Social de la Ciencia en los años 60. Su obra indaga en la crítica a los sesgos patriarcales y el lugar de la mujer en la producción científica. En 2021 publicó Amor, Poder y Conocimiento, hacia una transformación feminista de las ciencias, y la mercantilización de la bioinformación, la base de datos del sector de la salud de Islandia. Steven Rose es neurocientífico y profesor en neurobiología. Graduado en Cambridge, es director del Departamento de Biología y del Grupo de Investigación del Cerebro y el Comportamiento de la Open University de Inglaterra, especializado en mecanismos celulares y moleculares del aprendizaje y la memoria. Sus aportes también son claves para una crítica de la ciencia en el capitalismo, en particular de reduccionismo y de determinismo biológico que justifican distintas formas de opresión. Escribió No están los genes, junto a Richard Lewontin y Leon Kamin, Trayectorias de vida, biología, libertad, determinismo, y Tu cerebro mañana, cómo será la mente del futuro, entre otras obras. En conjunto, Steven y Hilary han escrito Ciencia y Sociedad, 1969, La radicalización de la ciencia, 1976, Economía política de la ciencia, 1976, Alas, Poor Darwin, o Ay, pobre Darwin en español, 2001, y ¿Puede la neurociencia cambiar nuestras mentes? 2016. Well, at this point, I have to mention that the fact that Steven and Hilary are a neuroscientist and science sociologist living and working together is really an interesting fact. And I want to know if that was challenging and how did your work together start and which things did you have to face in working together?
Well, I shall start that one because my generation, our generation, was obsessed by the nuclear bomb. For us, it had the terror of extermination, which has risen again with the crisis with the climate and just everything at the moment. But we had that sense that, or I had that sense, I can't speak for Stephen, he was always more scientific. I had this sense, and so did my friend. We used to have nuclear dreams and nightmares, and we all talked about it. And, so the sense that people have now at the existential terror of the end of the world, I mean, that we knew, and you may say with less reason. But anyway, obsessed with this. Now, how was it science that I thought was about progress? How had it produced this terrible thing? Technology was, a little vague. It was science that got the blame. And there was also this thing, if this was progress, how come this terrible thing of bombing Nagasaki and Hiroshima? And I began to find myself moving in a circle of scientists. And, this was very, now there was a kind of political crisis going on. People were both leaving the Communist Party, as yet another crisis, and people leaving the Labour Party. So there was this sort of rather angry generation, which found no satisfaction, no home. So the new left was created out of that. And one of the things that it had was incredibly interesting meetings. And amusingly, they were held in a nightclub. So this crowd of very political people sitting in this ridiculous environment of little gold chairs and tables, and most of us sitting on the floor. And why we did it? It was Monday night. Nobody went clubbing on a Monday night. So it was dead cheap. Anyway, so there we were sitting. And this is where I met Stephen. And, and so our relationship began because I was absolutely obsessed with this science stuff. And here was a nice natural science to talk about it. And so we began to talk. And so it went on from there.
Indeed it did. It's gone on ever since for the ever since the mid-1960s, which is a long time now, and writing together as a scientist and a male scientist and a feminist sociologist of science presents a degree of problems. You have to learn a common language. You have to do in practice what this entire conference is about, of interdisciplinarity. You have to learn what words which mean one thing group of people, because they come out of the science, they come out of biology, mean quite different things to the person who's coming from sociology. And so learning a common language is also learning a common understanding of the relationship between the disciplines, and also to have, as a scientist, as a natural scientist, you have also built into you a sort of arrogance that as a natural scientist, you can do anything and everything. You don't need a sociologist, you don't need a historian, you don't need a linguist, because yours is a direct line to the truth. And you have to learn a little humility as a natural scientist, and to learn that other disciplines have other meanings and other words and other ways to understand the world, relates primarily to the sorts of questions we want to ask about it and the sort of answers that we're looking for in it. That's why I think, at any rate, that one of the main themes of your conference, which is the nature of the creation of scientific knowledge and the issue of reductionism, becomes so very important in trying to create the sort of interdisciplinary progressive framework that you are trying to do.
So let me interject, as it's the perfect moment. Not only was science in charge and the voice of authority, when I speak, let no one open their mouth, but also it was incredibly masculinist arrogance. And to watch the young physicists striding around, I mean, they were really arrogant. It was like being at a theatre. And
yes, well, they're the geneticists and the molecular biologists these days.
Yes, you should see them walk across the room. It's fascinating. But so we, like any other heterosexual couple, had this steady conflict going on, and the attempts to try fairly interview with one another, but being trapped and framed by gender, and the depth of the gendering process is incredibly deep. And you find yourself sometimes, I think, that as we grow older, we are almost returning to a form of gender relationship we both absolutely loathe. And it's sort of very strange, the life cycle in that way. So we tried, even at that stage, to be just, but we were not. And there was a lot of anger and pain between us, as I think there is in most heterosexual relations. So what do you want to talk about the book?
So just to thinking in terms of your experience, and also thinking in terms of what's going on now, or not necessarily now, but in the last decades, in terms of young scientists trying to pursue an academic career, what would you say that has changed? What are the challenges that younger generations need to face, and how could they deal with their personal lives and the way the academic life is being transformed? Maybe we can switch to that question if you agree.
Yeah. Well, when we wrote that first book, Science and Society, it was actually sort of classical of its time and so very different. We took for granted that the scientists, indeed, all people who were, I mean, the German word, Gesellschaft, were engaged in serious study of organized knowledge, and that all of us had the right to speak independently, and that we were free, relatively speaking, independently. Our money, our research money, came through the state. And at that point, the state did not interfere very much with the kind of work that was being done, except, and we are old enough to know quite a bit about that. But at that time, universities and staff had a relative autonomy. Now, nobody could say that now. It's much, much diminished. Where we were not working in line management. My impression of the contemporary university is there's a great deal of line management about, and people don't have that sense of being able to say something in the way that we could say something. I'm not saying you could say anything you liked. If you did say something that was too strong, you were certainly punished. But you did have much greater degree of freedom in what you said and what you thought. And I think this has been lost. And one way you can see this is the incredible growth of the administration in each and every university. And it is extraordinary, the number of administrators, compared to the number of academics, the number of students, and so on and so forth.
It's not only that, but it's also the sheer precarity of being a scientist or being in university or being an industrial scientist these days. Management is on top, You have transitory jobs, you don't have tenure, you have a few months' worth of contracts. The salaries are precarious, and the difficulty of remaining a creative and critical person in that context is much harder now than I think it was for us. And it wasn't easy for us. If you think of our own careers together, it's been very difficult. It's been impossible to find a way of working when both our jobs were in the same city. For many years, we were working nearly 300 kilometers apart and commuting at the weekends, because in the south of England, sociologists were regarded as perhaps a bit hazardous, and dangerous, because they were critical thinkers. In the north, where Hilary was, it wasn't suitable to be a leftist or a radical scientist. You had to be very much tied in with industry and definitely not expressing critical voice. So we were separated by the nature of our jobs. But now it's much worse. Commuting relationships are common. It's actually very, very difficult to actually sort of find jobs in the same city. And I think that also disrupts and makes very difficult the personal lives of so many of the young researchers today.
Thank you very much.
Do you go on, or
Hilary,
what do you want to do?
I think that Mariana has a very unstable connection, and we cannot hear you properly. Mariana wants to ask a question, but let's try again in case your connection is better.
I will try again, and if I can't, then I'll write it and you can read it.
No, I can hear you now.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you, do you think this situation is especially challenging for women? If it is, is there any place in science and in academy for other identities, maybe non-binary identities?
Look, I take a fairly tough look at what feminism has achieved. It's achieved a good deal, but let us be blunt. Bourgeois women have done a very great deal better than have working class women. Bourgeois women have risen and are paid pretty closely to the pay of men. Look at women who do the manual work. I mean, in the COVID crisis, they're the ones who've borne all the risk. I mean, so have the men, but we privileged women don't live in the same world. And when in the 70s and 80s we spoke of sisterhood, we meant it. I think that sisterhood is now pretty thin. And there's a tremendous amount of internal self-preoccupation, self-reflection, which as a 70s feminist, I find very sad, because we did work together, we collaborated much more. I mean, there was a huge strike of the miners, and feminists poured out of their universities or wherever else they were and went to work with the women who were supporting the miners' strike. And so that world has gone. And that makes me incredibly sad, because we've lost something very important, which is the solidarity between women. And I don't think we can see that. But to your other point, I think in the universities, women have made amazing inroads. That doesn't mean to say I think anything so silly as gender justice has broken out. No way. I mean, the pay differentials are real. There's a very funny study by the women at the MIT. They actually measured the size of their offices, and the men all had bigger offices. I mean, we do live in a world which, in some ways, is sort of pathetically organized. So these little tiny differentials to show I'm more important than you, they're still everywhere. So, but women have also made incredible inroads. I mean, it is simply, when I was made a professor, women could not get professorships in powerful institutions. So although I taught at the London School of Economics for 11 years, my chances of getting a chair there was zero. You could get a chair if you're a woman in a weaker university. Now, that is still true, but it's not as true as it was then. And, I mean, I dislike binaries, period. They usually tend to mean that one part, you know, it's like black and white. Think of that translated into the color of people's skins. It's like men and women. Think of that translation to the world. I mean, there's a lovely thing by Rebecca West, and she used to say, all, you know, great, very funny and savage American writer. And she said, all I want to be is a human being. And that's a big ambition. I don't think we've got anywhere near that. But what's your take on that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. We certainly haven't got any. But I want to turn to another transformation that's taken place over the decades, and that is simply in the natural sciences, particularly in areas like biology, like molecular biology, like genomics, and that's what we talk about in the book Gene, Cells and Brains, which I know has been translated into Spanish. It's not our most recent book, it's there. Is the way in which the managerial it's been tied up into the relationship between university scientists, companies in which they can become company directors, in which they can spin out from the laboratory private companies, in which their main interest is no longer the acquisition of knowledge, but the creation.
That's not quite fair.
Well,
I mean, you can't make the bucks if you can't do the science that impresses people.
Well, yes, of course, that's true. But one of the interesting things is how much of the basic science which is required in order to make the new knowledge is still state-funded. So a real recent calculation, for example, that 97% of the finance for the production of the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine was state-funded by the British. Only 3% comes at the end for the company. And that's true in many, many areas of technological innovation. The companies come in at the very end. The state pays for the primary science, but the transformation, the translation of that into practical goods, that comes with the company. And that's where the spin-out companies from the universities, the university professor who is at the same time a capitalist manager with shares in the company, and at the same time also a government advisor on where the money ought to go and the companies which ought to be funded. Those people, these elite scientists, walk seamlessly between wearing one hat in the university, another hat in the company, and a third hat in the giving neutral advice to the government. And that has transformed the nature of the being a scientist, and has again emphasized the problem there is always for the young scientist, the young postdoc, the young researcher, the person with their own creative ideas and drive that they want, to actually find a situation in which they can develop that and can still have some sort of basic income.
Absolutely. I think that there are many realities for a small, tiny percentage of all the researchers. It is precisely the image of the researcher that at the same time is a somehow entrepreneur whose ultimate aim is to sell that spin-off company to a big pharma company or to a big tech company and become rich. So that aim is definitely there, probably for a tiny group of researchers within the elite universities from the global north, I would say. And what we see in the rest of the universities, both in the global north and all the universities from the peripheries, is a situation where the precarity of our jobs also constrains our ability to choose, to some extent, our topics. Not only the precariousness of the jobs, but also the limited access to funding also constrains research topics. So another question in relation to part of the things that you were saying that I think is definitely interesting to tackle concerns universities' autonomy, which of course we cannot forget that universities are part of the capitalist system. As such, they have always contributed in different ways, but the type of contribution and the effects these transformations are having on academic labor are things that are seen more and more nowadays. So I would like to ask you about that, and maybe then we can move to some of the questions that we already have on the chat.
Well, there is one quite dramatic difference between the universities that we grew up in and the ones you inhabit, which is that the populations of universities, particularly in the north, are incredibly cosmopolitan. Like, I don't think America could work as the mode of production of science without tremendous number of Japanese and Chinese scientists. I mean, they're a huge presence. In our universities, Chinese students are in incredible numbers, and you get some very funny situations, such as a young woman we know who's teaching Chinese, and she teaches a group of students, all of whom are Chinese, and they have come here to be taught by the English. I mean, it's, you know, this is, I mean, there's some bits about this world which are very different. Now, in some ways, that mixture is very good because, you know, the Brits were very much stuck in their island, looking out at the world, you know, and across the sea to France. This was a long way. And that has changed, and it's for the better. And I think it's important to do that. But I see the situation of young people everywhere as quite dreadful because, I mean, for example, I would get a research grant. Perhaps if I was lucky, it might be for 3 years for a postdoc, whatever. But if it was a 2-year grant, that young person would come in. The first few months, they tended to be wrapping up either their PhD or the last project they were working on. They then were very occupied with the research, but then they knew they had to get another job. So they would spend the last however many months sort of working overtime because they'd got to both wrap up the research that they were working on or leave it to me as the lucky person, and hunt for jobs. Now, this is an appalling world. I mean, it wasn't like that when I was young. You got a university job. If you did it with reasonable competence, you were given tenure, and then you didn't have to worry. So you could go on. You could actually afford to make a mess of something. You know, you could try a really brilliant idea, which actually didn't work out. And that sort of luxury and experimentation simply isn't built into this system. So the pressure on younger people to produce is completely new. And I think the psychic strain on younger research is to use old-fashioned language, quite unacceptable. You know, because there's no chance given to think. And it is the group, this tiny elite at the top, who have an extraordinary amount of influence. And Stephen spoke of the hats, but what is impressive is as you see these, mostly, but not entirely, men going around, as they take the part of the disinterested advisor, they wear that as if they are the consummate actor. You would never think they were loaded with stocks and shares. When they go to be the scientists, you would never think that they were the very interested advisor because they were associated with capitalist production. So you've got this extraordinary thing where people, I mean, the most skilled ones it's the most wonderful theatrical performance as they move from character to character with flawless grace. So that is now an extraordinary, I mean, the mode of scientific production has radically changed, and it's changed from top to bottom, from bottom to top. I mean,
one of the words which I don't think appears in the English version of the program for your conference is the word globalization. Maybe I missed it. The features, and it's been dramatically demonstrated, of course, in the COVID crisis, is the extent of globalization of science now. It's not, of course, Hilary pointed to the cosmopolitan nature of the big universities, at least in Europe and the United States.
It's in the rich countries.
In the rich countries. Well, yes, but as it were, China is richer now. But many countries are richer. But
it's all right. After Brexit, what's going on now, we'll be down there.
Probably.
But the other thing, of course, is the collaboration. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just saying that yes, we can. At some point, I think we lost you.
Sorry,
the only thing, yes. What about you?
Well, sometimes.
Okay, yeah. The connection today is quite unstable, I think, from everywhere. But no, I just wanted to add a reference to this idea of techno-nationalism, which was also quite vocal, quite illustrative to some extent of how the governments from poor countries are tackling the pandemic, the access to supplies, and not only, of course, to vaccines. This is definitely gross the way they managed the acquisition of vaccines, but it was already there when the different countries were struggling to get all I forgot the name, there is a specific name to say this, but all the equipment you need for the hospitals. So most of that is being produced in China, and how countries were battling and stealing shipments from all these materials. And yeah, I think that it shows the limits of globalization, but it also shows a very clear dispute of power between states from the global north, and also in that process, big pharmaceutical companies and other big corporations also from the global north. So in this respect, the pandemic was quite illustrative. Also, there was a question related to the pandemic and the rise of the extreme right movements, as well as or in connection with these anti-vaccine movements. So on the one hand, we see maybe a society that is recognizing itself as more and more driven by scientific and mostly techno-scientific results. However, there is a form of reaction that is quite reactionary, which is the anti-vaccine movements, for instance, or the people that think that the earth is flat. So have you thought about this? There is a question on the chat along those lines.
Yes, I thought the anti-vaxxers would be more important than they are. But the kill level of COVID is so huge that I think it has pretty much silenced them. Because when there's some very interesting stuff of doctors talking to the patients who haven't come for their vaccinations, and they aren't anti-vaxxers, they're worried about rather practical things like, will the vaccination interfere with my other medicines? What will happen? And so I think the anti-vaxxers, I could be wrong because I've not seen any research literature, but I think the anti-vaxxers have been pushed back. The idea that it was rather like flu, with for us, probably about 140,000 people dead. It's getting on that way, it's 127 officially, but that's twice the number of civilians who were killed in World War II from the bombing. So people, it's a formidable thing. So many families have been touched. The thing I would say is nationalism important, but God, class and race are hugely powerful. The proportion of people of colour amongst the dead, and people who are the manual workers in the fight against COVID amongst the dead, and the terribly injured with long COVID. And this is completely unsuited. So you've got the battle between nations and nationalism in vaccination, and in the provider, what they call it, protective equipment. You're right in everything you say, but that fight is going on at the same time inside the rich countries. So our care home workers had nothing, and the hospitals sent their elderly people with COVID to the care homes who had no protection, inadequately trained staff. It was a scandal and a nightmare, and that's where the deaths were at their most serious. And that's the same in various other countries. So I think, while the the nationalistic fights are absolutely real. Everything you say, the class fight and the race fight inside our countries is very savage.
Yes, that's true. And the techno-nationalism about access to the vaccines and the failure to recognize the need to vaccinate globally rather than nationally, or to act as if we don't recognize that, that's very sharp. But the other thing which is the COVID crisis has exemplified is precisely the degree of globalization that I was trying to talk about before, in particular the ways that data was shared between the different companies, between the different researchers. The journals rushed to open to preprints.
That's not globalization.
And a huge amount of collaboration across nations and through and between otherwise conflicting countries. Notice, for example, the degree in which the Chinese made the genomes available very, very quickly around.
But that isn't globalization. That's what happens in a crisis. People come together because they must. And globalization, yes. I would argue, is something very different.
But the research has been global and come from many, many places. And it's involved collaboration.
But they never would have shared it in the past. I mean, that would be the nationalism coming in. But the nationalism is still present. Yes. That cooperation was actually primarily driven, I would argue, and again, I can't produce the evidence, by the scientists, the necessity for the sharing of knowledge. And they did that. I mean, it was astonishing. These very expensive journals just opened their pages to anyone. And this was quite extraordinary. You're absolutely right in that. But I would argue that is not globalization. That is, as it were, global state panic, war, but it isn't about globalization. Fair?
She's a sociologist. I'm not going to argue about it.
Well, sorry, that's a typical Rose exchange. You wait till he gets on to me about the molecules.
Well, it's really interesting.
Where do you think we should go, Cecilia?
I wanted to ask you if you believe that the fact that the vaccine, now we will talk about molecules, was developed in public research institutions and university, for example, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, but then it ended being distributed by big pharma companies, and it still hasn't reached the majority of people around the world, and it's expensive and governments have to buy it, and there's loads of complications. You think this proves that the Prometeic promise of science as like solving all problems of mankind is a lie? I think this might be an example of that. I don't know if you think the same.
Well, why do you think Big Pharma and its friends attacked the AstraZeneca vaccine? Could it be because it was too cheap? Could it be it was because it was for the public interest? I mean, forgive me sounding cynical, but, I think one has to be aware that, and there are a lot of journalists and so on and so forth, and they will fund. I mean, not saying that vaccine is perfect, but the incidence of risk is so modest. I mean, I sometimes say, look, if you ask somebody who betted on horses to look at the odds, I don't think they worry about AstraZeneca vaccine too much. I mean, because if you understand risk, you can see that the emphasizing of that risk is, frankly, scientifically absurd. But it's, manufacturing a panic, manufacturing anxiety, and there's money there.
Tons of money. Actually, it's interesting that in Argentina, I don't know if you were aware of, probably you were not. So let me just tell you in 1 second that Argentina was among the first countries that bought the Sputnik vaccine, which is the Russian vaccine produced by a public laboratory, even though it has also some private funding. And it was the media here, most of the mass media were directly like shouting against this vaccine, saying that it had not published the phase 3 results, that it was not safe, and so on and so forth. A similar attack came against the Chinese vaccines, and there were even arguments going back to communism and saying that this government was a populist government attempting to buy only populist vaccines. And this was also part of a bigger plot, in a way, because at some point the Argentinian government tried to buy the Pfizer vaccine, and they were accepting all the conditions. There were many, many conditions imposed by Pfizer. And at some point they said, we want a law that says that we will not be responsible for any risk associated to our vaccine. And the government said, no, we cannot give you like a blank check. That's too much. So they said no, then there is no agreement. And at that point was when the negotiations, I'm frozen. Okay. I'm okay now. So I don't know if you, it's good. I like the sign. I was just saying, I don't know if you heard me. I was just wrapping up the story about Pfizer and Argentina and how Pfizer tried to impose very stringent conditions to the government, to Argentinian government, for selling us the vaccine. And in the end, the government said, we cannot give you a blank check. We cannot just say that no matter what happens, you will not be responsible because it's your vaccine what we would be buying. So they decided not to buy it for the time being. And they went forward with the other vaccines, including the AstraZeneca one. But it is clear that there is a big fight with many negotiations that go under the table. And what is often lost in that discussion is that we're mostly always speaking about public research or research that is based on previous research that was funded by the public sector, that if it's not entirely publicly done, it was mostly publicly funded, as it was the case of BioNTech, who received money from the German government, the European Union, and then after all, it was, now we speak of the Pfizer vaccine, and nobody knows who's BioNTech. So this goes back in a way to what you were discussing before, Stephen, about scientists becoming...
There's no doubt that vaccine national politics have played a part. I mean, there's no doubt that the way in which the Chinese vaccine has been distributed is not, as we would say, neutral, but it has as much of a political agenda as any of the other vaccines that are going there, as much as the Belt and Roads financing of industries in Africa and in Asia by the Chinese. So you can parallel that with the distribution of the Chinese vaccine. And it's also very interesting to see the way that despite the collaboration, the bad mouthing of the Chinese or the Sputnik vaccine has remained. So those debates and those tensions are there, and you wouldn't expect anything different in a capitalist, in even a globalized capitalist society. And the vaccine, the whole COVID epidemic has shown incredible examples of collaboration and cooperation and attempts to work together.
Generosity.
Solidarity, to use the word. And at the same time, it's revealed if you like, the naked muscle power of capital, even of big pharma in this way. And those are very revealing. It takes a crisis both to actually foster new forms of development and new forms of collaboration, but also to lay bare the structure of those that existed before. And I fear that COVID has done all of those things.
Absolutely. Along those lines, we have precisely... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, just let me take you back, actually, to the days leading up to the Second World War. And we had a very interesting conversation with a biologist then. And he said when they realized that the war was coming, and that they would have to fight the Nazis and they were occupying Europe, said every biologist, every scientist, perhaps every person thought, what can I do? So the biologists all recognized that the one thing they could contribute to was wounds, because this is pre-antibiotics. So it wasn't by chance that penicillin came. It was because the biologists understood that the issue of wounds was central to winning a war. And so here you got this tremendous emphasis on vaccines. So all the work coming from virologists, public health people, everything is put together under these particular conditions of this incredible challenge to life itself. And this is sort of very interesting. So yes, the issues about, it's something bigger than a nation state war, what's going on now. The threat to so much of the globe is there. And this has produced some very interesting responses, which I wouldn't want to see dissolved in the sort of mechanisms of social division, which we see and understand very well, like the ones I've been talking of, the difference between workers, particularly manual workers, and the intelligentsia, to say nothing of the uber rich. We know those things and they don't go away, but this crisis posed by COVID is actually, if you like, more interesting, because you've got these patterns of cooperation. And there was some lovely writing in one of our better journals by a natural scientist who was working on a vaccine, and he was talking about this very interesting tension between a very high level of a cooperation, but also a sort of competition that it would be very nice to the one who got there first. So, you've got this lovely, I thought there was a beautiful description of how scientists work, intense competition, but also when someone is the first, does the thing that is needed, a tremendous admiration. So I don't think it's reasonable to reduce everything to these grand conflicts, of nationalism. And I think it's actually much more interesting because there's these plurality of sometimes selfless generosity, even between nations. I mean, Stephen was speaking about the Chinese giving the genome. That was a big gift. And there are very few people who are gracious enough to acknowledge it. I mean, they're still ranting on about the evils of the Chinese. And I just think, well, I would, of course, as a sociologist, I think everything is very complex. And so I don't want to make simple divisions, because I think the situation is much more complex. And I must tell you something funny, because it's so delicious and so different from anything else. We have a dear friend who is a Serb and comes from what she and we would have called Yugoslavia. Now, she keeps an eye on what's happening at home, and she tells us it's very funny that the Chinese are pouring vaccines in. There's all the commercial ones we know of, there's everything there. And she says they have so many vaccines that you can simply go down to the vaccination station and say which one you want. So if you want a Pfizer, you can have a Pfizer. If you want an AstraZeneca, okay. So, and it's actually the abundance of vaccines is so great, and this is the surreal bit, that Americans are flying there to get their vaccine shots, as they would call them, and they're staying there for, say, the 3 weeks in order to get the second shot. Now, I mean, I love that. It's so crazy. But it's also an expression of almost every ism you can think of. I mean, the extraordinary thing of Americans flying in because it's difficult to get vaccination. You can get a free one in Yugoslavia. And it's just, I add that as sort of, I think sociologists really enjoy the confusion and the complexity. And I think a lot of us resist the rather easy explanations that we used to use. And, when you think, there's a huge element of racism in this. It's, but anyway, okay, go back to science.
Yes, thank you. I will ask you a question of the audience. In your book, Genes, Cells and Brains, you criticize the gap between science and workers and people in general, and you call for a science for the people. don't you think the current crisis, which is a capitalist, ecological, and health crisis at the same time, poses a necessity of closing this gap? And do you have any thoughts about how could it be done?
Well, we need a lot of us.
And maybe if you want to, I will also ask you a question that is related to that one that was asked very earlier on, just to so that maybe we move also to broader topics and not only the pandemic, but it's related to that question. It was written by Nicolás Fernández La Rosa. He says, hello, first it's a pleasure to see and hear you. I am Nicolás Fernández La Rosa, and I had studied biology, reading your interventions in Science for the People, for example. And my question is about what to do not only not only as researchers, but also as professors to fight into the institutions that contain us as workers and students, to give us space to discuss the ethical and political aspects of our research. So I think these two questions go together in the sense of thinking of workers, strategy, scientists, and in particular for scientists and for students and for professors. So part of the working class, but also broadly going back to Juan Duarte's question, a strategy for the working class in this very challenging context.
Do you want to start?
Well, Britain had a number, I speak this British case, of tremendous crises. We had what was known as mad cow disease, we had foot and mouth disease, there was some other colossal crisis. And what was seen, particularly by the scientists, where there was a crisis in trust in science. So then there began a whole lot of things. The scientists, in a slightly simple-minded way, thought it was because we, the non-scientists, were slightly stupid, and if only they explained it to us properly, we would agree and say, of course, and we trust you now. Now, you could argue this was also an anxiety on the part of the scientists, that if enough of the non-scientists distrusted them, we'd be unwilling to give our taxes to scientific research. So all sorts of things going on. Now, what then happened was it got to something rather more interesting, in which, and this was actually particularly through my profession as sociologist, because we were arguing that to get any change, you had to do it, and the environmentalists, that you have to work it, you have to do it at the beginning of the process. You can't put the modifications, the improvements in at the end. So you need to talk with people at the beginning, and this was called public engagement. And for a little while, it looked as if the many publics, it's never one, the many publics could and should take part in this process. But very rapidly, and there was a lot of support for this. I mean, the committees began in the House of Lords, the House of Commons took it up, the scientists took it up, and there was for a little while an extraordinary level of interaction between scientists and non-scientists, and with much more with working class people. And that period has rather done what I frankly would have anticipated, which is that it's professionalized. And we've got the growth of ethicists and the growth of people who are interested in the participation of non-scientists, of, quotes, ordinary people. And these have become, so if you go for a big grant, on the grant, you will have to get the money to pay for an ethicist and a social scientist, because without it, your grant proposal is not likely to be successful. Now, what that does to the ethicist and the social scientists, are they free to speak? What can they say? Can they say, this is a terrible idea, this research is leading to disaster? And they're not independent. They're not disinterested. And it's partly because of the way that the money works. So I see this business of getting the public involved, democratizing science. I see that as the system that we have is incredibly resilient. It has enormous skills at adopting and appropriating and taking strength out of these various initiatives, which have come often out of popular resistance, and they accommodate them, and they become university jobs. And what was a popular involvement has been professionalized. So I see it as a constant struggle. Now, so I see with absolutely welcome, open arms, the rise of the environmentalists and this enormous counterattack that they've been waging, which of course has been severely interrupted by COVID, because people are so preoccupied with fear and so on and so forth, that the energy of that movement is diminished. It's not gone. It's still alive, and it's not got the force that it has. So I see this as this question of democratizing science. I think under some conditions you can make some advances, and in other conditions you're not going to have a very good time, or we are not going to have a very good time. And so I have what do you think?
Well, I want to couple what you just said with the second question about science for the people.
Oh, yes.
And it's worth thinking a little bit about the history of that, which came originally, the movement came originally from two places. One was opposition to the Vietnam War, particularly in the United States, but also in Britain and other countries as well. And the second was the developing critique of students and workers against the hierarchization of the universities. Yeah. So they were looking for democratization within the university. And the movements themselves did two different things. Outside the university, some of the activists who were researchers would actually say, okay, we'll take our scientific skills and we'll try to apply them and work with working class groups, with political movements, with trade union struggles and so on, to combat and to provide scientific support for the work they are doing. So you got the development of things which were called science shops. In Britain, we had groups working specifically with trade unions. We were working, because my neuroscience was particularly one of the most contentious issues, racist issues that arose in Britain at that time, was about the claim that people of colour were genetically stupider than white people. So there was a white superiority that was there. So we were working also with working class and with black mothers and parents.
That was you much more than me.
Yes, I was saying this came out of the work in my lab and the people I was working in our research group. So there were those sorts of activities that were going on. And at the same time, the students themselves were actively organizing, and the young researchers. So laboratories became occupied in Japan for many, many months, in Italy for quite a long period of time, in Britain much less. I don't know how it was in Argentina, I'm sorry. But this was a fairly worldwide movement. And it was a movement which called for the democratization of the work in the laboratory itself, so that students and professors, researchers, technicians, the lab cleaners would take part in laboratory meetings and to try to decide the direction of research. I have to say that this was not an experiment that was very successful. I learned to my cost, as several did American colleagues who tried to work in the same sort of way. What you can't do is make socialism in one laboratory any more than you can make socialism in one country. However, it was a learning and a painful experience. Now, of course, the situation is actually transformed because of the authoritarian and managerial nature of the universities. The precarity of people's position means that it's very difficult to take a stand of that sort or to work in that sort of way. But the idea of taking science out of the labs and into public engagement, public activities, working with trade union and groups, working with parents, seems to me to be one direction in which science for the people is going and can go now.
Well, social sciences is something very similar. I mean, yes. The kinds of things that I was engaged in. I mean, for example, I was responsible for teaching graduate students how to research. And I thought the best way of teaching this is to do it with them. And I was given the whole lot, be about 20-odd graduates, very, very committed young women and men. And what would happen is, well, I think I've always been something of a community activist. What would happen is that I would learn off, or somebody would contact me saying, you know, she can do it. And I would get my students to go and meet this group of, say, council tenants, public housing, meet them and try and understand the problem. Now, in one place, it was a very simple case to solve from a research point of view. What was happening was that in the evenings, the lavatories, the toilets flooded, and everything out of the drains was all over everyone's flat. And they came to and said, how can we stop this? And it was quite funny. We did some rather obvious things, and we found out that it was actually the television programs. Everybody went out to have a pee at the same time. And so you've got this sort of television skill. So the question was, we then knew that the issue was the plumbing had to be fixed so it could deal with these timed responses. So in an interval between one half of something and the other. Anyway, some things were as simple as that. Others were extremely complex, in which the only way of working was to do much more ethnographic research, and then had to work with students and say, look, when you're talking about your research with one another, you must not go for a drink in a pub in the area, because somebody will hear you. And so you learned, you know, how to manage discretion in research, how not to risk the research, how to take people's, I mean, if you've said to somebody, I will not speak about this, this is confidential between us, and you're heard gossiping about it, this is disaster. It was a wonderful trend. And also the nice thing is that if students, I mean, they are really good students and who are committed to the well-being of, if you like, everyone. The thing you can say to them, look, this is the most important research that you do, because you cannot make a mistake. Because if you make a mistake, it's not just you who get criticized, but real people will really suffer. And it actually produces a tremendous level of competence. I remember once a huge number of figures to handle, and I was flinching. And one of these students, who was a physicist, a postdoc, who decided he couldn't bear physics any longer and wanted to become a social scientist, he said, oh, don't worry, Hilary, I'll sort that out. So he went to, this was the very earliest days of using computers. I mean, they terrified me. They were huge, physically, just huge. And he just went and sorted it out and came back with the data. I mean, it was heaven. So you've got this sort of wonderful collaboration and people learning very fast and supporting one another very generously. And so all the time we used to have the switch, this ancient, pre the technology you've lived with forever. I mean, the switchboard was extremely nice, which these extremely nice women looked after. One of them would ring me and saying, oh, there's a group of people from XYZ and they want one of your research studies. And, you know, so I would have to find, and there's one beautiful study to, we call it participant observation. And a friend of mine did this. It was a care home for elderly people. And he put in, I don't know, something like a dozen students. And their job was to be there between them 24 hours a day, watching, making notes, talking with people, everything. And, you know, the results that they found were absolutely fascinating. But what was really nice was, and it goes back in the earliest days of research, the participants, the so-called subjects, loved it. And they were incredibly happy having all these really interesting, nice, bright young people being fascinated by them. And so the local authority kept ringing us up and saying, wouldn't you like to do another research program in one of our care homes? So you got, so there were kind of new arrangements. I think that was the beginning of something could have been really positive. And, so inside research, whether you're doing natural science research, like some Italian women, friends of Stephen's and mine, they were working with the Neapolitan women working on leather because there were some absolutely carcinogenic dyes that were being used in it. So, these really quite distinguished biologists, quite senior people, professors, they were working alongside these trade union organized groups of women to try and stop the industry using carcinogenic materials, and they were successful. So there were so many going on. And actually, I don't think disciplinarity was terribly important in that period. We weren't working so tightly in discipline. We were working much more collaboratively. And you can't really put a wall around yourself and say, oh, you don't do that. And you had to cooperate and at least look as if you could do a bit of the science. Don't you think it's like that, much more collaborative?
But I think also that to come back to the way in which the question that Cecilia was framing about science for people and working with workers, etc., comes. I think the important thing is that the demands, the recognition of the need for information, for scientific work, for scientific collaborators working with you has to come from the people, from the workers themselves. You can't impose that.
No.
If I'm a militant scientific activist, I want to make my knowledge useful to people, I can't just go around and say, sort of, look, you need to know about this or you need to know about that. It has to come from outside.
What about those lovely women who wanted to use your computers?
Oh, well, yes.
That was the heavenly story.
Oh, this is indeed.
But on that respect, Stephen, what if because workers and the way you are trained, even if you don't go to school or if you do, you will be trained in a way not to challenge your reality, not to contest it. And so I understand what you're saying, and I agree that we should not arrive at a place and say, okay, here is all the knowledge you never asked for, but here it is anyway because I know all the answers and you know nothing. But at the same time, there is a challenge, I think, for us as researchers to try to inspire other people that do not have this training, that are not reading and thinking the type of questions, and that are not trained in this type of reasoning, of criticizing pretty much everything.
No, that's arrogant. Everybody thinks, and if you listen to people, really listen to them, they think bloody well. I mean, people are not fools. I mean, this is one of the most, well, sorry, get cross, but I mean, basically, if you have the patience to listen to people, you find that they've got a very good grasp of the situation. They may know that it's not wise to articulate that in a lot of contexts, but if you just sit down with someone, I mean, one of the things that was being studied was the impact of, oh God, what was the Russian one? Chernobyl, because there were hotspots that developed in a northern part of England. Now, we also had some nuclear energy stations there. Now, when you went and talked and listened more than anything else to what these farmers had got to say, they had a much greater real understanding of the problem for agriculture than the, quote, expert, the well-trained scientist who came from the Ministry of Food, because compared with their knowledge, he was an idiot. And
I get it. I get it, and I agree, but let me agree and disagree at the same time, because we are in an era where fake news occupies a big space. And we were discussing in a panel earlier on today, and I will not remember the exact phrase, but it was a phrase with which one of the speakers closed his speech. And it was something like, he was quoting someone else, and he was actually saying something like, it is easier to convince people about a lie than to explain people that they were taught a lie and that actually that was not true. And it happened to me, just give you an example. Yesterday, I crossed by a neighbor. I had COVID. Stephen and Hilary know that already. Now everybody knows that I had COVID until last week. And so my neighbor was asking me, are you recovered? Are you okay? And she works as as a healthcare worker. So after answering, I asked, oh, and you've already probably gotten your vaccine. And she replied, no, of course not. I will not get any of these vaccines. They're all a lie. And she started telling me stories about monkeys, about the fact that these vaccines were not in phase 7, and things like that are completely insane and crazy. So it's true that when we focus on a problem and when we go and talk to the people that are specialized on that work every day on that, know a lot of things, and we should be humble and also learn from each other and co-produce knowledge. But it is also true, and in this case, this was a healthcare worker. I think she's a nurse, and she was at the same time saying things that are clearly lies that she heard from fake news and so on. So I think it's a challenge, and we should, and it is not so easy just to say that people know what their problems are nowadays, at least.
I think if you listen to them, and you spend really quite a lot of time listening. It's not a quick thing. It's not just a quick chat. It's actually letting the conversation go on for some time and perhaps coming back. It's more like anthropology. And, it's a question of just listening, discussing it, coming back to it. And, to do that, it means you have to expose a lot of yourself. You can't expect a conversation to be one way. You have to take the person seriously and tell them what you think and so on. But I think that, yes, there are people like that. And, what I've learned, again, from sort of COVID kinds of situations, that where, for example, the mother was refusing to have a vaccination, when her son had COVID, she changed her mind. And I think if the threat comes close, and it is, that health workers, and they are in Britain as well, are resisting vaccination, I think there needs to be some pretty serious work done trying to understand, and whether it's because nobody is taking enough time to let them talk through their anxieties until they have satisfied themselves. Because this is what, it's not, you can't call it research, but this is what insightful professionals are telling us. And, I need to listen to them. That if you give somebody enough time to talk about why they're frightened, there is a long history of fear of vaccinations and a reasonably well-founded fear, much as I'm in favour of them.
Especially in France, interestingly, French hostility to vaccines is much greater than in any other country in Europe.
Yeah, but it's the only country that its public health supports alternative care. So when you come from the chemist, you have 2 bags. This one is full of modern medicine, and that one is full of naturopathic medicine. It's extraordinary. So, that the French healthcare system can throw away quite so much money on this magic stuff. I'm not saying all of it is, some of it's very sane, but it is, that is the only country I know of where that's done. So, I think the French may be a special case.
Yes.
To come right the way back to the question of I think was at the core of what you were saying and what Mariana was saying was what was that old question of what is to be done. And we're too old, basically, but we can actually, I think what we can do is to actually respect where things are happening, which are important and significant. And for me, one of the most interesting and important things that are going on, Hilary mentioned them earlier, are the climate change activists, Extinction Rebellion, because we're now at an existential crisis for the future of humanity. It's not just a question of socialism or barbarism, it's a question of actually
all living things.
All currently living things. I'm as sufficient of a biologist to recognise that life forms will evolve post-humanity. Meanwhile, I have a certain wish to humanity to try to survive itself and not to destroy itself so willfully. And it's a pretty uphill struggle, and it's hard to retain optimism in the face of the clear refusal of the long-term need for the short-term gain. But that's the directions in which we have to go. And that's where the struggles, I think, have to be. And people like me can respect them, or Hilary can respect them from the outside. Cheer them on.
Yes, but you know,
I think I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think that Mercedes is about to read a question from the audience. Really sorry to interrupt you but we only have 15 more minutes. So maybe we can move to some of the questions that we have on the chat, because we are accumulating a bunch already.
Yes, even though some of the questions have already been sort of replied by Stephen and Hilary, there's a question by Matthias Blaustein that says, in relation to Juan Duarte's, I will make a side note. Juan Duarte is part of the team that translated Stephen and Hilary's book into Spanish, so I wanted to acknowledge his presence here. Regarding some specific dimensions of the hegemonic model of science, such as reductionism, commodification, Promethean promises, is the actual pandemic leading to criticize these aspects, taking into account the possible zoonotic origin of the pandemic, the inequality in terms of access to health and vaccines, the pharmaceutical business profit, or on the contrary, is leading to strengthen the faith in the hegemonic model of science, perceiving actual science, vaccines, for example, as the only solution to our problems.
Well, do you want to play with the reductionism one?
I'll come on to the reductionism one.
Okay, well, I'm not feeling that sharp.
Okay.
Maybe if you want, I can just read you in the meantime a comment while you think a bit about the question. There is a comment that came from the people that are watching through the YouTube channel. I don't know who that comment is coming from, but I'm just going to read it. It says, very interesting to hear about your years as activists. I think we need to learn about the mistakes of the past, but even more important, to return to those ideals. I mean, to fight against capitalism. So I think that Matthias' questions is also along those lines, mostly between, is there a space for a counter-hegemonic project given the pandemic, or actually things will become worse and worse after, and as we are partly seeing in these late months around the world, especially since the vaccines were out, but also before?
Well, short answer, it depends on the level of resistance. And that's not something that we can be part of, except, as Stephen said, as cheering on at the sides. I can do a little bit more. But I mean, basically, there is resistance. I think the resistance, particularly environmentalists, have been held back by COVID because of the social distancing and all of that stuff. It makes it very difficult. But I would say something that is one of the things that fascinates me is that the environmentalists are creating new forms of resistance. You can see the traditional left. The thing is, you have to have a meeting and somebody speaks, and then another person speaks, and then another person speaks. And if you're like me and you've been to ever so many of those meetings, you could say it for them. And they're very boring. That's the truth. And then there's the other thing is, how do they protest? Well, they take some banners and they go down to this place and they stand there and they talk amongst themselves for a while, and then they go away. Now, this has been dead in the water for a long time. The environmentalists aren't like that. They climb up trees, they dig holes, they race around on bicycles in London. Look, they stopped every bridge in London. Now, the left hasn't done anything as interesting there for years. So there's an immense creativity in the protest. And I love that because it's a real sign of vitality. And I mean, you know, several of you will know London, but there's a place where Regent Street and Oxford Street cross, okay? And in this intersection, there's a moment when, if you like, all the lights are on red. Now, what essentialist rebellion did was they took an enormous pink yacht and screwed it into the asphalt. And you couldn't get it out. And then they glued themselves on it. Now, I haven't seen the left do anything as interesting as that for years. So, and then they cycle around so fast that the police can't really know where they are. And I mean, and of course, the mobile phone. And so what people are doing is using all this range of new technology to organize, to be in the places where nobody knows. And it is immensely creative. And I take incredible pleasure from that. And it's partly, and it goes back to my love of history. There's a wonderful book. It's about the struggles of the unemployed workers in the 30s. And the leading figure wrote a book, which I have, and it's more or less about the 10 best demonstrations, and they were equally incredibly creative, and these were desperately poor. I mean, these people, some of the demonstrators didn't even have boots. I mean, this was a terrible time, but there's this wonderful account, and one of the best demonstrations took place in this same place where the pink boat was. So I see a sort of, you know, when people are really powerful in their resistance, they're very creative, and when they're reduced to ritual, I don't think you're going to get much change. So I feel quite optimistic.
I would say that, yeah, I like very much what you said about the new ways of protesting. I would just mention two other examples. One from Hong Kong, actually, and it's related to digital technologies and facial recognition as a way of trying to mitigate every form of protest, and how they use lasers to block the capacities of the cameras to do facial recognition. So that's that way of playing with technology and using technology for our own favor, and not only be suffering from the way technology is used to control us. I think it's quite interesting, challenging, and we could learn from that. And also, and I think maybe Mariana can say a word on that, and maybe a closing question or something, or just a comment along those lines, is in terms of the ways the feminist movement also has protested and introduced new ways of resisting.
Yes, of course. I would like to ask you, how do you think those relations that cannot be considered just so clearly established or so deterministic or so linear? In that way, I had a question. It was a bit theoretical maybe, but since reductionism was discussed recently, regarding how to face the crisis we are going through. In this event, we discussed a lot about feminisms and the ways feminisms fight this crisis, and of course the complex relations among feminisms and science. In that way, I wanted you to tell us, if we are thinking of inter and transdiscipline, and of course, we are thinking also about fighting sexism, patriarchy, and racism, and so on. I think we have to think again. I know this is an old issue, a traditional issue, but I think we need to wonder how are we thinking, and how is mainstream science thinking the relations between theories and disciplines. And well, I would like to know, how do you consider that the idea is still a current idea of hierarchical relations between sciences and disciplines? I think that is an obstacle for fighting the crisis from a scientific perspective.
Well,
I'm going to put a light on because I see our screen is rather dark.
Okay. I'd like to go straight. Well, it really goes into the history of the left and science. And that is, in the early period of the Soviet Union, there was an attempt to build a socialist science. It failed miserably, so we needn't go into that. But it meant that that the left joined the standard position of the dominant class that science was neutral. And you heard nothing for many years about the possible project of a distinctively socialist science. It came back, particularly with the Cultural Revolution, very forcefully, this idea that we could make a social science. It would be a science for the people, a science with the people. And that was an enormous project. And that was the one which inspired people from all over the world. I mean, the Cultural Revolution has been given such a hard time, justly and unjustly, but those objectives have been lost and what they meant. And so, for example, once we moved in the 80s, there were passionate debates about feminist epistemology, and I was part of that. And I sort of following sort of Lukács and all those. Anyway, what I wanted, and what several of us wanted, was what we called standpoint theory. And you can hear the echoes in that. And what we were arguing was that women's position in the world, and that is not woman's position, it's women's perhaps positions in the world, was different from that of men. And that is, we were put in the position of being in charge of the social reproduction, rather less than production. And that gave us a specific view, because it means that most women are involved in caring labour. We may not like it, we may like it, it can be alienated, it can be unalienated. I mean, one of the arguments that came very strongly from the Nordics, as Norwegians, was that caring for a young dependent child, or caring for someone who's sick, or caring for someone who's old, these were non-alienated forms of care, but being made to it being expected of you that you will wash his shirt, you will cook his bloody dinner, that is alienated labour, and women should fight against that sort of labour. So there were whole sort of connections there, and it was talked about that we would understand the world differently. I mean, epistemology is how do you know what you know? How do we know what we know? And so a lot of this was returning back to women's work. Actually, it's women's work in the laboratories. I mean, they don't get cleaned very much by men. You know, the replication of division of labour is everywhere. So, you know, and doctors used to speak of TLC, tender, loving care, being provided by the women nurses. So there was, what was this labour? And if you regarded it as alienated labour, then you began to be able to play with it. I mean, it means you learn from the work that you do, and that gives you different, historically new insights. And if you gather them together and you start thinking of a new theory of knowledge, well, it does change the way at which you look at both the, how shall I say, at the various worlds. I mean, I'm not saying, I mean, for example, a lot of work done on monkeys and apes. And that showed, I mean, I'm thinking of Sandra Hardy's work. That was Sarah Hardy, sorry, there were several Sarahs around. Sarah Hardy, and what she was talking about was what was going on between mothers and their babies. You know, these were, I think, some form of ape, but, you know, so there was this intense interest in what was going on and how that changed how you thought about interactions between animals. And roughly speaking, before the feminist primatologists started work, the general view of animals seemed to be that they were either having sex, violent sex, or they were killing each other, or they were eating. And films of what animals did was typically films of these actions, and the more violence, the better. The fact that animals spend most of the time just lying around being asleep was ignored. So there were real and significant changes in the content of knowledge and the way you looked at the world and the way you forced your understanding of that back into the knowledge base. And in some areas, there have been enormous gains. I mean, for example, we used to speak of hunter societies. Feminism and those friendly to it have forced in hunter-gatherers, because the gathering was not done with the men. And so, you know, knowledge has changed, and feminism has created huge changes. And we've seen, I mean, I used to work with a Muslim guy because he was trying to make, with others, a Muslim science. And it was quite extraordinary closeness between a lot of American feminist scientists and me and a few others in Britain, making an alliance with Muslims because they wanted something different. And we could understand that there isn't one single knowledge. We have different ways of looking at the world. Anyway, but I'm sure you capture what I'm trying to say.
Which brings us back.
Sorry.
Close to the end.
Close to the end.
We're close to the end.
Yeah, exactly. We are exactly, that's what I wanted to say. I hate to be the one that is the timekeeper, because unfortunately I have to bring the bad news that time's up. Maybe let me just open the mic for both Mariana and Mercedes to say, as I will say now in a second, thank you very much. This has been a huge pleasure for us and an amazing opportunity also for giving us this chance to discuss with you one-on-one. As always, it has been in my experience with you. I honestly encourage everyone in this room to read their books in general. If you can only read in Spanish, you already have one book, which is a great one to read it. So I encourage you to do so. And thank you very much, all of you, for being here. After Mariana and Mercedes say a word of goodbye, I would also like to ask you, Hilary and Stephen, if you want to say a final word, each of you, in 1 minute.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. And I'm sorry we didn't discuss the ways in which reductionism was the dominant mode of scientific production under capitalism. It comes out of exactly the point that Hilary was making early on, and it reflects on the question we didn't answer from Mercedes earlier.
I wish to thank you so much. This was great, especially many of the things you said made me reflect not only on my profession, but also on sometimes how we communicate these ideas or talk with people that do not belong to the science field. I do get the same feeling that Hilary says, that if you sit down and listen to people, you will find out that sometimes they understand better their realities than the specialists, especially in things concerning health or environmental impact. So it was really good to hear all the things that you had to say about it, really.
It's fun to argue with you.
Well, I just want to thank you very much. And everyone is saying thank you on the chat. So I will just thank you. So you can say a few words before we end.
It's been fun to talk with you. I hope the meeting is a great success, and on with the struggle.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you have done us so much good. Being older, so you're shielding, locked up, locked down. It's been a joy to meet you all. I mean, I feel several years younger.
It's been our pleasure. Honestly, it's been our pleasure, and hope seeing you in person or on another Zoom event really soon. Thank you again, all the participants. And as I mentioned also on the chat, now we move to parallel sessions where other research will be presenting. And after that, we have a closing panel discussing about different forms of sovereignty and extractivism and the final speech. So join us, all of you, and bye and thank you. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Estén muy bien.